I came home 4 days early, and I wish I could tell you it was because I missed my wife. It wasn't. It was because something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it then, and honestly, I'm not sure I can fully explain it now. I was sitting in a hotel room in Phoenix, had just finished the last session of a 3-day financial consulting conference, and I was supposed to fly back Sunday. It was Wednesday night. I was eating a room service sandwich I didn't want, watching a news channel I didn't care about, and my phone showed 0 missed calls. That last part was the thing. My wife always called. Every night, without fail, for 11 years of marriage. Sometimes just to say she was tired and going to bed early. Sometimes to tell me about something funny the neighbor's dog did. But she always called. That night, nothing. I told myself she was probably just exhausted. She had been dealing with some pain in her lower back for a few weeks. I told myself I was being one of those overprotective husbands who couldn't go 3 days without becoming irrational. Then I called her cell. Straight to voicemail. I called the house line. 12 rings. Nothing. I booked a 6 a.m. flight and barely slept. My name is Gerald. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a forensic accountant before I retired, which means I spent 3 decades being paid to notice when numbers didn't add up. People used to joke that I could smell a discrepancy from across a room. My wife, Diane, always said that trait made me insufferable at dinner parties, but a very good husband because I noticed everything. She meant it as a compliment, I think. At least 70% of the time. Diane was 58 when this happened. She was a retired elementary school librarian who grew tomatoes in the backyard, read 2 books a week, and had a laugh that could reorganize a room. We met at a church fundraiser 11 years ago. I was a widower. She was divorced. We were both too old to be nervous and both nervous anyway. I asked her to coffee and she said yes before I finished the sentence. I took that as a good sign. We had a good life. A genuinely good one. Nothing flashy. Our house in Raleigh, North Carolina was a 4-bedroom colonial we'd bought together 3 years into the marriage. We had a joint account for household expenses, our own individual retirement accounts, and I had a separate trust I'd established years before we met that held most of my investment portfolio and the deed to a rental property in Asheville. Diane knew about all of it. There were no financial secrets between us. That was a rule we both agreed on early. I also had a nephew, my younger brother's only son. His name was Marcus, and he was 34 years old. My brother Raymond passed away 6 years ago from a heart attack, and after that, I stepped into whatever role I could for Marcus. I helped him when he needed a co-signer on his first apartment. I lent him money twice, once for a car, once when he said a business venture had gone sideways. He paid back some of it. I didn't push on the rest because Raymond was gone, and Marcus was the last piece of my brother I had left. Marcus had been coming around more frequently in the last year or so. At the time, I thought it was grief, or maybe just growing up. He'd come for Sunday dinners, help me with yard work sometimes. Diane was warm to him because Diane was warm to everyone. She used to save him slices of her lemon pound cake in a container by the door, so he'd have something to take home. I did not know at that time that Marcus had also been quietly asking Diane questions about our finances, not in one big conversation, in small ones, casual ones. The kind you wouldn't notice unless you were a forensic accountant, which Diane was not. I landed in Raleigh at 9:40 Thursday morning. I hadn't told anyone I was coming home early. I took a rideshare from the airport because my car was in long-term parking, and I didn't want to deal with the shuttle. The driver was a quiet man named Theodore who played smooth jazz and didn't try to make conversation, which I appreciated. We pulled onto my street, and I saw Marcus's car parked in my driveway. A black Jeep Cherokee, his. Sitting right there at 10 in the morning on a Thursday. I remember thinking, very calmly, the way you think when something doesn't fit. Why is my nephew's car in my driveway right now? Marcus worked a remote tech support job. He could theoretically be anywhere. But he lived 40 minutes away and had no reason I knew of to be at my house while I was out of town. I had Theodore pull over half a block away. I don't know why. Old habit, maybe. When you've spent decades following financial trails, you tend not to announce yourself before you understand what you're walking into. I sat there for a moment. I called Diane's cell again. Voicemail. I called the house. I could hear it ringing from where I was parked because the front windows were open. No one answered. I asked Theodore to wait. I walked up the driveway. The front door was unlocked. I went inside and called out her name. The house was quiet except for the television in the den, which was on, but muted. I walked through the kitchen. There was a glass of water on the counter, half empty. A bottle of Diane's blood pressure medication next to it. The cap sitting beside it rather than screwed on. I called her name again. I heard a sound from the direction of the back hallway. I walked that way and found Marcus coming out of the door to my home office. Not the bathroom. Not the kitchen. My office, where I kept my filing cabinet, my desktop computer, and, in a locked drawer, copies of financial documents, including the trust paperwork. He saw me and went completely white. "Uncle Gerald," he said. "What? I thought you were in Phoenix." "I came home early," I said. "Where's my wife?" He opened his mouth, closed it. Then he said, very carefully, "She wasn't feeling well this morning. She called me. I came over to check on her." "Where is she, Marcus?" "She's at the hospital. I was going to call you. She said she didn't want to worry you while you were at the conference. So I was already past him and out the front door. The hospital was 11 minutes from my house, and I made it in 8. I will not pretend I drove responsibly. I found a parking spot and walked through the emergency entrance and said my wife's name to the woman at the desk and watched her face do a thing I had seen faces do before, that small, careful recalibration where someone is figuring out how much to tell you and in what order. Diane was in the ICU. She had been admitted at 7:15 that morning with what the attending physician initially believed was a severe cardiac event. But by the time I arrived, the doctors had begun to suspect something else. Her heart enzyme levels weren't consistent with a standard heart attack. Her potassium levels were critically abnormal. There were other markers, the kind a general practitioner might not immediately connect, but that a specialist would. I sat beside her bed and I held her hand. She was unconscious. She had tubes and monitors attached to her, and the machines made soft rhythmic sounds that I focused on, deliberately, because they meant she was still here. The attending physician, a cardiologist named Dr. Osei, came in and spoke with me. He was a careful man, methodical, and he chose his words the way someone does when they are professionally obligated to be precise. He told me that he had ordered a broader toxicology screening based on some unusual patterns in her blood work. He said he would know more within 24 hours. He also said, and I want to be exact here because the words mattered, "Mr. Gerald, the pattern we're seeing is consistent with prolonged exposure to elevated potassium. In a healthy adult with no prior kidney condition and no known dietary reason for these levels, we take that seriously." I asked him what that meant. He said he didn't want to speculate until the screening came back. I understood what he wasn't saying. I drove home that evening in a state that I can only describe as completely focused. There was no panic. I had learned a long time ago that panic is what happens when you stop thinking, and I was not going to stop thinking. Marcus was gone when I got back to the house. He had not left a note. I went to my office. The filing cabinet had been relocked, but I could see that the papers inside had been shifted, not dramatically, just enough that someone who organized his files in a specific order, which I did, would notice. I checked the locked drawer. It had been tampered with. The lock hadn't been forced, which meant Marcus either had the key, which he didn't, or had found some other way in, or had been trying and failed. The drawer was still locked. But it had been handled. I sat down in my office chair and I thought about everything very quietly for a long time. Then I did several things. First, I called my attorney. Her name was Patricia, she specialized in estate law, and she had helped me structure my trust years ago. I told her I needed an emergency appointment the following morning, that I needed to discuss modifications to my trust documents in a financial power of attorney. She heard something in my voice and said she'd clear her 9 o'clock. Second, I called my bank. I spoke to a fraud specialist and requested that any account with an authorized user other than myself be flagged for review. I also moved the significant balance from our joint household account into my individual account, temporarily, pending what I explained was an ongoing family concern. I left enough in the joint account that nothing would appear alarming on a surface look. Third, I drove to a hardware store and bought 2 small wireless cameras. I installed one in my home office, facing the desk and filing cabinet. I installed the other in the kitchen, angled toward the counter where Diane kept her medications. Then I called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting. "Uncle Gerald," he said. "How is Diane? I've been so worried." "She's stable," I said. "How is Diane?" "I've been so worried." "She's stable," I said. "Thank you for being there this morning." "Of course," he said. You know I'd do anything for you too. I let a moment pass. Then I said, Marcus, I was going through some things at the house tonight, and I realized I have some paperwork I've been meaning to update for a while. My trust documents, the beneficiary designations. I'm going to sit down with Patricia tomorrow and get things organized, just in case. Silence. A very specific kind of silence. That makes sense, he said finally. Yeah, good idea. I just wanted you to know, I said, in case you had any questions about where things stand. Another silence. Shorter this time. No, he said, no questions. We said goodbye. I sat in my kitchen for a few minutes after I hung up. The house was too quiet without Diane in it. I looked at the spot where her lemon pound cake recipe was clipped to the refrigerator with a magnet she'd brought back from a trip to Savannah. I looked at the reading glasses she'd left on the kitchen table. I made myself a cup of coffee, and I went back to work. The toxicology results came in 36 hours after Diane was admitted. Dr. Osei called me personally. He spoke in the same careful, methodical way, and then he said a word I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. Digoxin. It's a medication. It's actually a legitimate cardiac medication used to treat certain heart conditions, including atrial fibrillation. In the correct dose, under physician supervision, it's a standard treatment. Diane had no prescription for it. She had no diagnosis that would require it, and the level found in her system was not therapeutic. It was toxic. Dr. Osei told me that he had a legal obligation to report the findings to law enforcement given the circumstances. He told me this not as a warning, but as a courtesy, so I would know what was coming. I thanked him for that. I asked him how long she had likely been exposed. He said the damage pattern suggested weeks, possibly longer. I thanked him again, and I sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then I went to my laptop, and I opened my office camera footage from the previous 2 weeks. I want to explain something about how my mind works. I did not go into that footage looking for confirmation of what I already suspected. I went looking for facts, because facts are the only thing that hold up. Suspicion is not evidence. Emotion is not evidence. What I needed was evidence. I found it on a Tuesday, 13 days before Diane was admitted. Marcus had a key to our house. We had given it to him 2 years earlier for emergencies. On that Tuesday, at 2:17 in the afternoon, my kitchen camera showed Marcus letting himself in through the back door. Diane was visible in the footage briefly, in the living room, apparently asleep on the couch. Marcus stood at the kitchen counter for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. He opened Diane's medication organizer, the weekly pill box she used to keep her prescriptions sorted. He removed several pills, placed them in his jacket pocket, and then placed different pills into several of the compartments. He closed the organizer. He looked around the kitchen for a moment. He left through the back door. I watched this footage 4 times. Then I called Patricia and told her to hold my 9 o'clock appointment, and I called a different number. A detective I had worked with years ago on a corporate fraud case, a woman named Detective Carver, who was still with the Raleigh PD. She picked up on the 3rd ring and I said, Sandra, it's Gerald. I have something I need you to look at. She came to my house that afternoon. I showed her the footage. I showed her Diane's medication organizer, which I had not touched since I found it the night before, and which still contained pills that did not match any of Diane's prescriptions. I gave her the name of every account Marcus was authorized on, every loan I had co-signed, and the dates of every financial conversation Diane had mentioned to me in passing over the last several months. When you are married to a librarian for 11 years, you learn that she remembers conversations verbatim. I had kept a mental record of everything she had relayed to me. Detective Carver was quiet for most of the meeting. At the end, she said, Gerald, you did the right thing not confronting him directly. I said I knew. She said, we're going to need a few days to get a warrant and do this properly. I said I understood. I also said, Sandra, he was in my home office while Diane was in the ICU. He was looking for the trust documents. She nodded slowly and said, we'll move as fast as we can. During those few days, I visited Diane every morning and every evening. She regained consciousness on the 2nd day. She was weak and confused, and the first thing she said to me when she recognized my face was, You're supposed to be in Phoenix. I said, I came home early. She said, You always come home early. I said, Only when it matters. She smiled at that, just barely. She was too tired for more. I held her hand and I stayed until they asked me to leave. On the morning of the third day, I called Marcus and asked if he would come over. I told him I'd had a long conversation with Patricia and I wanted him to know what I'd decided about the trust. I told him I thought it was important that we talk face to face as family. He said he'd be there by 11. He arrived at 11:04. He was dressed carefully, I noticed. Pressed shirt. He'd gotten a haircut since I'd last seen him. He sat down at my kitchen table and accepted the cup of coffee I offered, and he looked at me with an expression that I know now was carefully constructed concern. I sat across from him. I said, "Marcus, I want to ask you something and I want you to think before you answer." He said, "Of course." I said, "Did you change Diane's medication?" The expression on his face collapsed in stages. The way a building demolition works, you can see the structure trying to hold for just a moment before physics takes over. He said, "What?" I said. "I have footage of you at this counter on a Tuesday 2 weeks ago. I have the pill organizer, I have the toxicology report, and I have Detective Carver, who is parked outside right now." He didn't say anything else. Not a single word. He put his coffee cup down very carefully on the table, which I remember thinking was a strange thing to do in that moment. And he sat completely still. Detective Carver knocked on the door 40 seconds later. I want to be honest about how I felt in that moment. I did not feel satisfaction. I did not feel the thing people sometimes describe as closure. I felt tired, and I felt grief. And I felt something that I'm still not sure has a clean name. My brother's son had sat at this table and eaten my wife's pound cake and helped me rake leaves and called me uncle, and he had stood in my kitchen and swapped out her heart medication with something that would kill her slowly enough that it might look like natural causes. He was 24 when my brother died. He'd had nowhere else to go. I had tried. I don't know what more I could have done. I've asked myself that question enough times now that I've accepted I may never answer it. What I can tell you is what happened next. Marcus was arrested that morning and charged with first-degree attempted murder and felony poisoning. The investigation revealed that he had researched digoxin toxicity online, that he had purchased a supply through a contact he refused to name, and that the method he used, gradual replacement of Diane's blood pressure medication with calibrated doses of digoxin, had been planned carefully and executed over approximately 6 weeks. He had also, in the weeks before Diane's collapse, begun asking questions of a mutual family friend about whether a spouse could contest a trust if the beneficiary designations were outdated. He had apparently decided I hadn't updated my trust in years, and assumed he was positioned to inherit something if Diane was out of the picture, and I was alone and more easily influenced. What he didn't know was that I had updated my trust 2 years ago. Diane was the primary beneficiary. A charitable remainder trust was the secondary. Marcus had never been in it. He had planned this for a woman who wasn't even standing between him and anything. Patricia told me that when she heard this detail, she actually had to put the phone down for a moment. I understood the feeling. Diane was discharged from the hospital 19 days after she was admitted. She came home on a Thursday, which felt right to me, though I couldn't explain why. I had cleaned the house and bought flowers she would probably tell me were unnecessary, and I'd made a pot of soup because it was the one thing I could cook reliably. She walked in the front door and stood in the entryway looking at the house for a moment, the way you look at something familiar after you've almost lost it. She said, "You bought flowers." I said, "You can complain about them later. Sit down." She sat down, and I brought her soup, and we didn't talk for a few minutes, just sat at the table together, the way two people do when they've both been scared and are still coming down from it. Then she said, "The lemon pound cake recipe, you didn't move it." I said, "I left everything exactly where it was." She reached across the table and put her hand on mine and didn't say anything else, and neither did I, because there wasn't much else needed right then. Marcus pleaded guilty 8 months later to avoid trial. He was sentenced to 18 years. The judge, during sentencing, made a point that the premeditated and prolonged nature of the poisoning demonstrated a level of deliberation that warranted the maximum range. Marcus's attorney argued for leniency based on family circumstances in the absence of a prior record. The judge was not moved. I was in the courtroom. I didn't say anything to Marcus when they let him out. I had already said everything I needed to say, which was nothing. Some conversations don't need to happen. Some things you just let the courts handle. Diane came with me that day. She wore a blue coat I'd always liked on her. On the way out, she took my arm, and we walked to the car without talking, and she waited until we were both inside before she said, "Are you okay?" I thought about it. I said, "Getting there." She said, "Good, because I need you to stop at the grocery store. I'm making pound cake this weekend and I'm out of lemons." I looked at her. She looked back at me with that expression she had, the one that was somehow both completely serious and completely aware that she was making me feel better on purpose. I started the car. I said, "You know, for a woman who just survived a poisoning, you have a very strong opinion about baked goods." She said, "I have strong opinions about everything. That's why you married me." She was right. That was exactly why I married her. We stopped for lemons. I bought 2 bags, which was probably more than she needed. She didn't say anything about that. Some things you just do. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, I want you to know something. I'm not telling it to make Marcus into a monster, or to make myself into a hero. I made mistakes with Marcus. There were signs I was too loyal to see clearly. Too many times I wrote things off because he was Raymond's boy, and I missed my brother, and that grief made me a more forgiving man than the facts warranted. I don't say this to be hard on myself. I say it because if you have someone in your life who is slowly asking questions they have no reason to be asking, who is too interested in things that aren't theirs, who makes you feel like your generosity is an obligation, pay attention to that. Your instincts exist for a reason, and if you came home 4 days early because something felt wrong, and something was wrong, trust that feeling. It doesn't always mean catastrophe, but sometimes it means exactly what it feels like it means. I wasn't supposed to be home. I'm glad I came home. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe to Dad's Honest Revenge and hit the bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. This community means more than you know. I'll see you in the next one.